Hey, what's going on, everyone? My name is Zach, and my video essay is going to cover a 60-second portion of the 1940 film Rebecca. So, a little context about the film. Well, as I said, it's a 1940 film, and it's based on a book, Rebecca, by Daphne du Maurier. And it's Alfred Hitchcock's first American project. Basically, this young woman marries a fascinating widower, but she has to live in the shadow of his former wife, Rebecca, and basically she also has to deal with the secrets of her new husband, as well as the jealous and obsessed nature of the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. So the clip that I'm about to play goes more into the relationship between this young woman and the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. So I'm going to play that clip now.
I've opened a window for you. A little air will do you good. Why don't you go? Why don't you leave Manderley? He doesn't need you. He's got his memories. He doesn't love you. He wants to be alone again with her. You've nothing to stay for. You've nothing to live for, really, have you? Look down there. It's easy, isn't it? Why don't you? Why don't you? Go on. Go on. Don't be afraid.
So what we can get from this scene is essentially visually conveyed. It's less of a dynamic action that we can observe and more of storytelling through those visuals and through those shots. So essentially, we have the young woman weeping on the bed after having, stormed into Rebecca's bedroom to confront Mrs. Danvers about the incident with the ball costume. And so Mrs. Danvers opens the windows. We have a medium shot of that. And then we turn to look at Mrs. De Winter, who she's standing over. And we get a close-up of her face. We see that she's still in distress. We see that she's clearly upset about what's going on. And Mrs. Danvers, she's being portrayed as the one who's in control, the manipulator, if you will. Because essentially, she has this neutral, kind of nonchalant expression, despite all of the crying that Mrs. De Winter is still doing. And so, as we see this young woman stand up and stumble to the window, the viewer is then introduced to a shot between she and Mrs. Danvers, in which lighting is key. We see that there's significantly more light on Mrs. De Winter than on Mrs. Danvers in some of these specific medium shots and close-ups, which further solidifies Mrs. De Winter's innocence in the whole situation. But we also see less light on Mrs. Danvers. And what that says is it portrays, in a way, the shadiness that comes with Mrs. Danvers' character, because there were earlier scenes in the film in which Mrs. Danvers was a very mysterious character in the film. And right here in this specific segment, we're seeing some of that obsession, some of that mysteriousness actually come to light. No pun intended. In addition to the mysterious factor that we get from Mrs. Danvers, the close-ups of Mrs. Danvers and the lighting and all of that, we're then introduced to close-ups that align with the dialogue that's going on here. We see that with these close-ups, Mrs. Danvers is attempting to manipulate Mrs. De Winter into leaving Manderley, or better yet, jumping from that window that she had opened, jumping from that window to her death, basically. And so, for a moment, based up on the close-up of Mrs. De Winter's facial expression, it almost seems like this is going to work, because she kind of stops crying, and she's more like just has this blank stare like, should I do it? She's taking in these words that Mrs. Danvers is putting out, that Mrs. Danvers is feeding her. She's absorbing all of these words that, oh, he doesn't need you. He doesn't love you anymore. He just wants to be with Rebecca. He never did love you in the first place. And so she's taking all of this in, and she's looking down. We're wondering if she's actually going to do it. In a 1940s audience, this moment would have had viewers on the edges of their seats, and it brings out a lot of storytelling elements that really put a lot into perspective about this film, including the mysteriousness of the wealthy life in comparison to the average, with other movies of the time period, like Citizen Kane, which came out a year later. We see this theme of the life of the wealthy, which includes both the rich and the housekeepers, I suppose. It shows that people in these wealthy environments have aspects of mysteriousness and ambiguity to them that wouldn't be extracted the same way from someone that the audience could further relate to. But this environment is different, from the fact that there was a whole bedroom that belonged to Rebecca that was no longer being used, added to the mysterious factor. And the fact that they were in this bedroom contributes to that. So, what do we know about this film? It was understood as a horror film at the time of its release, and it established two key trends in horror during the 1940s: potential market for horror films targeted at women, and a prestige production that demonstrated horror need not be relegated to the less profitable, low-budget end of the market. So essentially, horror could be fancy. Now, the Gothic or Paranoid Woman's film was not an existing category in the USA during the early to mid-1940s, but one could categorize it as such, considering that Rebecca is a woman's film involving those themes of paranoia. So essentially, the takeaway from all of this is that while in the current day, one would classify this film as a Gothic Paranoid Woman's film, it does not necessarily make this film not a horror film. In fact, this film is a pivotal film in both 1940s horror film and the evolution of the horror movie genre. Now, many critics would say that the Gothic Paranoid Woman's film is a feminine dilemma that denies women the investigating gaze or punishes them for it, per Jankovic's horror in the 1940s. And this is true to an extent in this specific scene, because Mrs. De Winter chose to go to the ball wearing the outfit in the painting, which was investigative because she didn't understand why Maxim's reaction to this was so negative. She was trying to figure out what Maxim would like. She thought he would like it, but this would end up being a mistake. And the main thing that she learned from this was that Mrs. Danvers had some kind of hate or jealousy towards her because she was trying to set her up for that outcome to occur. This does not negate the film's legitimacy as a horror film, though. Gothic Paranoid Woman's film is defined as a film that is targeted towards women, which Rebecca is targeted towards women. It is a woman's film, and it involves the main character's difficulty in making sense of their world, which is what the critics highlighted as being a particularly feminine dilemma. However, this film is based on a Gothic novel, and Gothic novels were explicitly identified as both tales of horror and mysteries. And there's definitely horror and mystery in this scene. The horror in this scene comes solely from the fact that Mrs. Danvers is trying to get Mrs. De Winter to jump out of the window. It's a horrific act. It's like, why would you try to get her to do this? The mysterious aspect of this is that the viewer in the audience is now wondering why this is happening. Most would conclude that it's due to some sort of jealousy, but there's still so much mystery within this scene. So overall, this scene is one of many in Rebecca, which highlights that despite the film's current classification as a Gothic Paranoid Woman's film, it still falls under the genre of horror because of the psychological manipulation and thrill that occurs within scenes such as this. This is proof. This makes it evident that it's a horror film.